Okay, so imagine this, right? A president basically acting like a rogue agent.
Oh, this is going to be good.
Yeah, pushing the limits of their power almost to the breaking point.
Oh, I'm listening.
It's 2025, and we're looking at a second-term President Trump.
Okay.
And honestly, some are even calling this a full-blown constitutional crisis.
Wow, a constitutional crisis.
That's what they're saying, right? You've got my attention.
So we've got this whole stack of sources here.
Lay it on me.
We've got a legal opinion piece from Newsweek.
It's
News reports with quotes from experts, politicians, both sides of the aisle.
So we're getting a balanced perspective.
Absolutely. Got to hear from everyone.
I like it.
And even some insights into the legal landscape for transgender people during this time.
Interesting. How does that tie in?
Well, you'll see how it all connects, but the big question is this.
Hit me with it.
Is President Trump playing by the rules of the Constitution?
The age-old question.
Or are his actions a dangerous deviation from what we expect in a democracy?
All right, let's dive in. Let's dive in. So first, to set the stage,
Okay.
we've got this opinion piece from Newsweek, and they're arguing that President Trump's second term is putting a lot of pressure on the system of checks and balances.
Checks and balances, right, the cornerstone of our democracy.
Exactly.
So what are they saying specifically?
Well, the author, Nicholas Creel,
I know Creel, he's a sharp legal mind.
yeah, he's a law professor.
Right.
And he doesn't mince words. He calls Trump's actions on things like TikTok, federal spending, and birthright citizenship a direct assault on the Constitution.
Whoa, strong words right out of the gate.
Right. Direct assault. Those are fighting words.
So what exactly is he referring to?
Well, let's break it down, right? So first you've got the TikTok issue.
TikTok, yeah, that was a whole thing.
Newsweek reports that Trump completely ignored a bipartisan law.
Wait, ignored a law? How's that even possible?
I know, right? And this law was even upheld by the Supreme Court, and it banned TikTok.
So he went up against Congress and the Supreme Court. Bold move.
And the justification. He cited donor influence and political strategy over legal precedent and the will of Congress.
That's a dangerous game he's playing.
Right. And this is where Creel really digs in. He argues that this disregard, this blatant disregard for the law, is a prime example of what Justice Jackson called the lowest ebb of presidential power.
Okay, hold on. Lowest ebb of presidential power. Explain that one to me.
Okay, so imagine a president acting against the express will of Congress.
Okay, so basically operating as a lone wolf, no checks and balances.
Exactly, unchecked by the other branches of government.
That sounds a little too close to a dictatorship for comfort.
Right, and remember, this is just a hypothetical situation, but it really gets you thinking.
It does make you wonder.
And it didn't stop with TikTok. The AP News confirms that he actually froze federal payments in an attempt to enforce his ban on diversity programs.
Diversity programs.
Yeah, and we're not just talking about a symbolic gesture here.
So what was the impact?
This move potentially affected trillions of dollars in federal funding.
Trillions. That's not chump change.
No, not at all. We're talking about funding for everything from police departments to domestic violence shelters.
Okay, so major implications.
Absolutely, and it raises some serious constitutional questions.
Right, because Congress controls the purse strings, right?
Exactly. The Constitution is very clear on that point.
So even if the president doesn't like a particular program, he can't just unilaterally cut off its funding.
Precisely. He can't just go rogue like that.
So what happened? Did he get away with it?
Well, thankfully, no. A federal judge blocked the freeze, and the administration had to back down.
Okay, good. Checks and balances in action.
It was a close call, though.
It makes you wonder what other levers of power a president might try to pull.
Doesn't it? And this next one is a doozy.
Okay, I'm ready.
Newsweek tells us that Trump issued an executive order attempting to redefine birthright citizenship.
Wait, birthright citizenship, as in anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen?
Exactly. It's enshrined in the 14th Amendment, and it's been upheld by the Supreme Court for over a century.
That's a pretty fundamental aspect of American citizenship.
Absolutely. And Trump tried to change it with a stroke of a pen.
So he tried to bypass Congress and the courts with an executive order.
Essentially, and this goes back to Creel's argument about Trump's disregard for the rule of law.
So what happened? Did he succeed?
Thankfully, no. A federal judge in Seattle blocked the order.
Good, because that would have been a major upheaval.
It really highlights the tension between presidential power and the Constitution.
Right. It's a delicate balance.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because this situation with birthright citizenship actually connects to the information we have about transgender rights and the 14th Amendment.
Oh, I see. The 14th Amendment is a common thread.
Exactly. The same principles of equal protection and due process that are at stake in the birthright citizenship debate are crucial for protecting the rights of transgender people.
So what happens in one area can have ripple effects across the legal landscape.
It's all interconnected, and it shows how important it is to understand these foundational principles.
It's a reminder that the Constitution isn't just some dusty old document. It has real-world implications for people's lives.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So we've got executive orders, birthright citizenship. What else is on the agenda?
Well, let's talk about the Impoundment Control Act.
Okay, Impoundment Control Act, that rings a bell.
The AP News reports that Trump's attempt to control spending has rekindled a debate over this law.
Remind me, what's the Impoundment Control Act all about?
Well, in a nutshell, it prevents presidents from unilaterally cutting off funding for programs that Congress has approved.
So another check on presidential power.
Precisely.
And what's the current debate surrounding it?
Well, some Trump allies are arguing that it gives Congress too much power and that it should be repealed or at least weakened.
So they want to give the president more control over spending, even if it means going against the will of Congress.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
That's a slippery slope.
It is, and it raises some fundamental questions about the separation of powers.
So we've got a president pushing the limits, challenging Congress, issuing controversial executive orders. How are people reacting to all of this?
Well, as you might expect, the political responses have been pretty divided. The AP News highlights this stark contrast, with Democrats using words like direct assault and unconstitutional to describe Trump's actions.
Strong words.
They're not holding back.
Any specific quotes that stand out?
Well, Senator Angus King, an independent from Maine, said, "What happened last night is the most direct assault on the authority of Congress, I believe, in the history of the United States."
Wow, that's a pretty serious accusation.
And then you have Senator Bernie Sanders, who said, if President Trump wants to change our nation's laws, he has the right to ask Congress to change them. He does not have the right to violate the United States Constitution. He is not a king.
Okay, so the Democrats are clearly not on board with this.
And what about the Republicans? Are they all rallying behind Trump?
Not entirely. While some Republicans are firmly in his corner, others are expressing some concerns about his methods.
Like who? What are they saying?
Well, Senator Kevin Cramer, a Republican from North Dakota, said, "I think he is testing the limits of his power, and I don't think any of us are surprised by it."
It sounds like even some of his supporters are a bit uneasy about how he's going about things.
Yeah, it's not necessarily about the goals, but the methods, and this unease speaks to a larger concern.
What's that?
Is all of this adding up to a full-blown constitutional crisis?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something we'll definitely need to unpack further as we continue this deep dive.
I'm ready when you are.
So we've seen how this fictional President Trump is really pushing the boundaries here. But what's to stop this from happening in real life, you know?
Yeah.
What's there to prevent a president from getting too much power, like actually becoming a dictator or something?
Well, that's where the brilliance of the Founding Fathers comes in.
Okay, they were pretty smart guys, I'll give them that.
Right, they knew a thing or two about power, especially after just fighting a whole revolution to get rid of a king.
They weren't about to create a new monarchy here.
Exactly, they learned their lesson.
So how did they prevent that from happening?
They came up with this system, a system of checks and balances.
Checks and balances? I've heard that term before, but can you break it down for our listener? Like, what does that actually mean in practice?
Okay, so picture this, right? You've got 3 branches of government.
Okay, the 3 branches.
Each one with its own powers and responsibilities. It's like a 3-legged stool.
Okay, I'm following you.
You've got the legislative branch, that's Congress. They're the ones who make the laws.
Right, Congress makes the laws.
Then you've got the executive branch, the president. He's the one who enforces the laws.
Okay, makes sense.
And then you've got the judicial branch, the courts. They're the ones who interpret the laws.
Okay, so Congress makes them, the president enforces them, and the courts interpret them. But how does that keep any one person from becoming too powerful?
Well, each branch has ways to check the power of the other 2.
So they keep each other in line.
Exactly. It's this constant back and forth, a delicate balance.
Okay, so give me an example. How does Congress check the president's power?
Well, they have the power of the purse. That means they control the money.
Money talks, as they say.
Right. And if Congress doesn't like what the president is doing, they can just cut off the funding.
Oh, so they can basically defund the president's agenda.
It's not always that simple. There's a lot of political maneuvering involved, but yeah, that power of the purse is a big deal.
That's a pretty powerful tool.
It is. And they can also impeach and remove a president who's acting out of line, abusing their power or whatever.
Impeachment, that's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, we could do a whole deep dive on that sometime.
Okay, we'll save that for another episode.
But for now, just know that Congress has some serious firepower when it comes to checking the president.
So they can make laws, control the money, and even remove the president from office. That's a lot of power.
They do. And then you've got the courts. They play a crucial role, too.
The courts, yeah. What's their role in all of this?
Well, they're the guardians of the Constitution. Their job is to interpret the law and make sure that everyone is playing by the rules, including the president.
So they're like the referees of the government.
Exactly. They make sure that the actions of Congress and the president are actually constitutional.
So they can step in and say, hey, you can't do that. That's not how this works.
Yep, they can strike down laws or executive actions that they deem unconstitutional.
So it's a constant tug of war, a balancing act between these three branches.
That's the beauty of it. It's this dynamic tension, a system where no one gets too much power for too long.
It's all about checks and balances, making sure everyone stays in their lane.
Exactly. But here's the thing. This system only works if everyone respects the rules.
Right, if everyone plays fair.
But when a president starts ignoring laws, bypassing Congress, or trying to pressure the courts, that's when things get dangerous.
Like they're trying to rig the game.
Exactly. And that's what makes this fictional scenario, as crazy as it might seem, so concerning, because it shows how fragile our democracy really is.
You keep using that word, fragile. What does that actually look like? How can we, everyday people, protect this whole checks and balances thing?
That's the million-dollar question, right? How do we, the people, safeguard our democracy?
Yeah, it seems like such a big, complex thing. Can one person really make a difference?
It might seem daunting, but trust me, every little bit counts.
Okay, so what can we do? Give us some practical steps.
Well, first and foremost, stay informed.
Okay, stay informed. That's a good start.
That means reading beyond the headlines, digging into different sources, fact-checking, and yes, even listening to podcasts like this one.
Shameless plug. I love it.
But seriously, it's about educating yourself on how our government works and what's at stake.
So we know what to look out for.
Exactly. And then it's about holding our elected officials accountable.
How do we do that?
Let them know when you agree or disagree with their actions. Write to them, call them, show up at town halls, make your voice heard.
So basically, don't be afraid to speak up.
Exactly. And most importantly, vote.
Use your voice, use your vote.
Every election, no matter how small, is a chance to make a difference.
To shape the direction of our country.
And don't be afraid to engage in respectful dialogue with people who have different viewpoints.
That's a tough one these days.
I know, but it's crucial. We need to be able to talk to each other even when we disagree.
Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together.
We are. And we need to remember that democracy is not a spectator sport.
You can't just sit on the sidelines and expect things to work out.
It requires active participation, engagement, a willingness to stand up for what you believe in.
It's like a muscle. You got to keep it working, keep it strong.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of safeguarding our democracy, one that's often overlooked.
Oh. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It's not just about the formal mechanisms of checks and balances. It's also about upholding democratic norms.
Okay, democratic norms, what are those?
They're like the unwritten rules of the game, the traditions, the expectations of behavior that have guided American politics for centuries.
So it's not just about what's legal. It's about what's right, what's ethical.
Precisely. And when these norms start to erode, it can weaken the foundations of our democracy, even if everything is technically legal.
Okay, I see what you mean. So what are some examples of these norms, and why should we care if they're eroding?
Well, one of the big ones is the norm of presidents respecting the independence of the Justice Department.
Okay, so the president shouldn't be interfering with investigations or trying to use the DOJ for their own political gain.
Exactly. That's a big no-no. It undermines the whole idea of checks and balances.
It's like the referee being in cahoots with one of the teams.
Right. It's not a fair game anymore.
And what about other norms?
Another important one is the idea of presidents accepting election results even if they lose.
Right, the peaceful transfer of power. That's crucial for a democracy.
It is, and we've seen in recent years how fragile that norm can be.
Yeah, once you start questioning the legitimacy of elections, it opens up a whole Pandora's box of problems.
It does. It erodes trust in the system, it sows division, and it makes it harder to address real issues.
So these norms, even though they're unwritten, they're really important for a healthy democracy.
They are. They're like the glue that holds everything together.
So how do we protect them? You can't exactly pass a law against violating unwritten rules.
That's the challenge, right? But I think it starts with awareness, recognizing that these norms exist and why they're important.
So education is key.
It is, and then it's about calling out bad behavior when we see it, holding our leaders accountable for upholding these norms.
So basically, we need to be vigilant. We need to be watchdogs.
We do. We need to remind our leaders and ourselves that there's a right way to do things, even when it's hard, even when it's inconvenient.
Because at the end of the day, it's about protecting our democracy. It's about preserving the system that allows us to have these conversations in the first place.
You nailed it. It's about remembering that democracy is not a given. It's something we have to constantly work for, fight for, and defend.
So we've talked about those checks and balances, right? And how important it is to uphold those unwritten democratic norms. But I always find that looking at real-life examples, cases from history, really helps to drive the point home.
Oh, absolutely. It's like taking a theory out for a test drive, seeing how it works in practice.
Exactly. And history is full of presidents who have, well, let's just say they've tested the limits of their authority.
Some more successfully than others.
Right. Some walked that tightrope, some took a bit of a tumble.
It's a real-life stress test on the Constitution.
So let's dive into some of those examples, shall we? What are some presidents throughout U.S. history who really pushed the boundaries of their power?
Well, one that immediately springs to mind is Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War.
Lincoln, huh? What did he do?
He made some pretty bold moves, some would even say controversial.
Like what?
Well, for one, he suspended habeas corpus.
Okay, habeas corpus. Now, for our listener who might not be a legal scholar, what exactly is that and why is suspending it such a big deal?
Sure, so habeas corpus is a fundamental right. It protects individuals from being unlawfully detained. Basically means you have the right to challenge your imprisonment in court.
Okay, makes sense.
Suspending it means the government can detain people without trial.
Whoa, that's a pretty extreme measure.
It is, and it was highly controversial at the time, and he also expanded the army without congressional approval.
So even in a time of war, when things are chaotic, that tension between presidential power and the Constitution is still there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a constant struggle, a balancing act.
So what was Lincoln's justification for these actions?
He argued that they were necessary to save the Union, to preserve the nation.
So he felt like he had to do whatever it took, even if it meant bending the rules a bit.
Exactly. But critics saw it as a dangerous overreach of executive power. They worried about the precedent it would set for future presidents.
It's a slippery slope, isn't it?
It can be, and it raises the question of what limits, if any, should be placed on presidential power during times of crisis.
It's a question that we still grapple with today.
Definitely, and it's one that each generation has to answer for themselves.
Okay, so Lincoln, Civil War, got it.
Yeah.
What other examples come to mind?
Well, fast forward to the 20th century, you've got Franklin D. Roosevelt during the Great Depression.
FDR, the New Deal. That was a pretty transformative period.
It was. He vastly expanded the role of the federal government with his New Deal programs.
Right, things like Social Security, public works projects, all sorts of new initiatives.
And it was a huge shift in the relationship between the government and the people.
And not everyone was happy about it.
Right. There was a lot of pushback. People argued that he was overstepping his bounds, that he was giving the federal government too much power.
But others saw it as a necessary response to the economic crisis.
Absolutely. They felt like he was doing what needed to be done to get the country back on track.
So again, we see that tension, that debate about the limits of presidential power.
It's a recurring theme throughout American history.
And it's still relevant today, especially in light of this hypothetical situation with President Trump.
Exactly. It makes you think about the precedents we're setting, the long-term consequences of our actions.
So looking back at all these historical examples, do you see any common threads, any patterns that emerge?
Well, one thing that stands out is that these expansions of presidential power often happen during times of crisis. Wars, economic depressions, national emergencies.
It's like when things get really bad, people look to the president to take charge, to fix things, even if it means breaking some norms or pushing the limits of their power.
Right, because in those moments, the usual rules don't seem to apply.
It's like the stakes are so high that people are willing to accept things they might not normally tolerate.
And that's when it's most important to be vigilant, to make sure that we don't sacrifice our core values and principles in the name of expediency.
Because once those principles are gone, it's hard to get them back.
Exactly. And that's why this fictional scenario is so thought-provoking, because it forces us to confront these difficult questions, to think about what we're willing to tolerate in the name of security or stability.
It's a reminder that democracy is a constant work in progress. It's something we have to actively defend and protect.
Couldn't agree more. It's not something we can take for granted.
So to wrap up this deep dive into presidential power, what's the one key takeaway, the one big idea you want our listener to walk away with?
I think it's this. Presidential power is a double-edged sword. It can be used for good or for ill.
And it's up to us, the people, to make sure it's used wisely and responsibly.
Exactly. We need to stay informed, we need to hold our leaders accountable, and we need to be willing to speak out when we see something wrong.
Because the health of our democracy depends on it.
It does, and that's a responsibility we all share.
Well said, well said. So, to our listener, we say this: stay curious, keep asking questions, and never take your democracy for granted.
It's a precious and fragile thing.
And that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another thought-provoking topic and a fresh stack of sources to explore. Until then, keep those minds engaged and those conversations